First, we're going to explore a little bit about general communication theory. Skills that might be useful to you in communicating outward bound messages to those people that you'd be meeting with, either individually or to a slight extent in groups. We haven't got a lot of time built into the training here for group dynamics. We have one small section. Certainly I don't have to tell you. You can tell me that sometimes it's far more effective and efficient if you can get constituency groups together than it is to have to go one-on-one, but then most of the time we're probably going to be doing one-on-ones at least until you know all of these constituency people better and can start pulling them into coalitions or non-coalitions or whatever. So basically what I want to say about communication as a starter here I think applies to both situations, but you'll have to make that decision. When we communicate in a constituency relations program with opinion leaders, the primary thing we probably are trying to do is to stimulate their own word-of-mouth continuing communication. That's our real goal, isn't it? Because if they're going to be opinion leaders, they have to beacon the ideas. If they just take what you've told them and they kind of just sit there with them, that isn't going to help. They've got to get them out into their networks. And so we need to remember that this value added for our ambassadorial program is our ability to present information to them, to communicate it quickly enough and dramatically enough to make sure it touches their needs enough so that they're going to want to share it with somebody else. It's really the difference, if you will, between public relations and advertising. They say that advertising is a situation where we say about ourselves what we believe, and public relations is what other people say about us, which they believe. Well, obviously, the credibility of the second is far greater than the first. Beaconing through word of mouth is the essence of other people saying what they feel about us. And so that has to be our goal. The trouble is there's a lot of misunderstanding about the grapevine through which this kind of word-of-mouth communication occurs. I think we have downplayed it far too much in the business world. We've tended to think of it as very untrustworthy. You know, things get out there on the grapevine, and when we use that term even, it has a sort of a pejorative meaning. Oh my gosh, the rumor mill, the grapevine. There's a fellow at Arizona State named Keith Davis who's been studying grapevine communications now for almost 3 decades. And his studies are absolutely enlightening and overwhelming. The first thing he finds is that the grapevine is not erroneous the way we think it is. It is not misleading. But the grapevine indeed may be the most accurate communications medium that we have. Now, if that strikes you as odd, think about it for a minute. What do people pay attention to in a communication? Do they pay attention to the details, to the facts? I think we covered that yesterday. We know they don't. They pay attention to their perceptions, to some impressions that they get. And here's why the grapevine is ultimately accurate. The grapevine postulates that the executive vice president and his secretary took off to Hawaii with $100,000. Now, by the time it gets to the 4th person, the executive and his secretary took off to Tahiti with $400,000. And so everybody says, oh, it's terribly inaccurate. Absolutely not. It's totally accurate, because the key piece of information there is that these two took off with some dough. Where they went, how much, is really unimportant. That's just a little gossipy detail. The information that has impact on the people involved is they left, and they took a little bit of our kitty with them. Now, tracing that kind of information through the grapevine, Davis finds that it is about 90% of the time right on the money. To understand it, you have to remember, don't pay attention to the details, because we do tend either to enlarge or reduce the details as the story moves along. That's exactly what we're going to be dealing with when we go out and try to stimulate word of mouth with people if we aren't terribly careful. So there are a certain number of rules. And the first rule in communication today is that the world is totally over-communicated. They can't handle all the information. The average American today is bombarded with 1,400 messages every single day. 1,400 messages of one kind or another. The worst part is that most of us would like to act on, to behave according to maybe 300 or 400 of those. It is literally impossible. In a 24-hour day with no sleep, we could not respond to 300 or 400 messages. That's the problem. This is one of the reasons why, as I explained yesterday, Joe and Jane's six-pack seem to be dropping out, because they just can't handle the overflow. Now, given that situation, when we go out to work in a constituency relations program, we have to be very careful not to increase the over-communication. And while we may want to share a certain amount of data, detail, facts with the people, we have to train ourselves very carefully to make sure that what we leave with them is one or two strong impressions, memorable impressions, because those they can remember with some accuracy, and they can pass them on. A group of scholars of communication in New York State have developed a 4-level matrix for effective and ineffective communication. Let me just share it with you. On level 1, the communicator comes to the person that he or she wishes to communicate with, and their attitude is, gee, I'm a good person, I'm very right and friendly, but other people I'm not too sure about, they're apt to be wrong and hostile. I am right and friendly, you are wrong and hostile. Result, very little communication, because we exhibit that attitude so quickly. Now, I would imagine I wouldn't have to go too far back into Mountain Bell history to find some examples where the company may have tried to communicate with those of us out there in the great public with that attitude, that the company was right and friendly, but the rest of us were all wrong and hostile, and therefore people should do things our way without question. Clearly that doesn't work. The second level that they identify is where the communicator comes and says, well, I'm a friendly person, I'm right and friendly, but others are wrong and misguided. They're not hostile anymore, it's just they've still got it wrong, and the trouble is they're just misguided. If you just really knew, you wouldn't think the way you do. The inevitable result of that is that the communicator tends to ask patronizing questions and to treat the person with whom you wish to communicate in some infantile, childish way, with, again, the anticipated result, very little communication. Level 3 is where the communicator says, well, I am right and friendly, and I trust other people, they are right and friendly too. In this case, communication occurs. The door is open for communication. But the trouble is, both sides are apt to be talking at one another. I give you the respect of saying you're kind of like me, but still I want to talk to you and you want to talk back to me, and the messages are kind of passing in the night. So according to these scholars, if we want to be effective communicators, we have to change the word. What word in all of that do you think we have to change? The word right. When we go to people, it's not I am right and friendly. It's I am a friendly person that wishes to learn. And I think you are a friendly person who wishes to learn. So that I am willing to hear you, and I trust that you are willing to hear me, and since we're both friendly, we can talk about this, and out of that will come some true communication. But even at level 3, if it's I am right and friendly, and you are right and friendly, we're only going to be talking at one another. Now, obviously, we can't control what they are, in fact, but we can control what we are and the attitude we display to them about what we think they are. And clearly the answer is we want to be learning and friendly, and we want to show them that we think they are learning and friendly, willing to grow in this subject together. When you're out there communicating with people, are there any quick rules that will be helpful? Yes, there are. From among the thousands of formulations of effective communication, let me just give you 2 sets of rules of effective communication. The first set goes like this. Rule number 1 is don't stiffen the resistance. Now I realize you're never supposed to start with a negative, but in this case you have to, because there is always resistance out there to every message. If we start out recognizing that it's there, either on the surface or back inside somewhere in their attitudinal base, then we know the first thing we cannot do is in any way to call forth that resistance, that natural resistance, or stiffen it in any way, because if we do, it's all over. There's no communication going to take place. If we can remember that, in other words, if we come to them as learning and friendly, which is not apt to stiffen anybody's resistance. I'm a friendly person. I'm here to learn from you. That is not the kind of thing that stiffens resistance. If we can do that, the second rule is always ask for a willing suspension of disbelief. A willing suspension of disbelief. See if we can convince people to just hear us out. Leave your attitudes out of it for a while. Hear what I have to say. Humor is a wonderful way to do that. If you can get into a humorous frame, a little joking back and forth, it tends to let people be willing to hear what we have to say. The funny thing is, most all of us are experts at asking for a willing suspension of disbelief, but we just don't recognize it. When you get home tonight, if something has occurred to you that's unusual today and you're at the dinner table and you want to describe it, but you're not sure people will listen, what will you say? You'll probably say, you won't believe this, but. And when you say you won't believe this, but, you're simply asking them to give you a willing suspension of disbelief. Just hear me out. If we can get through those barriers, it's easy, because the only other rule is tell them what's in it for them. These two really are merely the gate. This is the rule. That, by overwhelming numbers of studies, is what people want to know. Now, problem. Organizational communications, in a number of studies, have been shown to violate this rule 90% of the time. We go out and tell them what's in it for Mountain Bell and not what's in it for them. And everything we know about effective communications means we have to flip that around. Well, I'm sure you can handle that little problem, so let me give you another very recent study. I told you yesterday that the bullet theory had died in 1936. Believe it or not, from 1936 till today, communication scholars, of whom there are now thousands around the world, were literally unable to give us any rules of what does work then in communicating information. About 10 years ago, the government hired a young man named Jim Grunig at the University of Maryland to take a look at a tough problem. The problem was drunk driving. They said to Jim, would you mind simply reviewing all that we know about communications and behavioral science and applying it to drunk driving, because we're not getting anywhere in our drunk driving campaign. Jim was equal to the task and indeed developed a model of behavioral change that is now being used in drunk driving, stopping forest fires, wearing seat belts, and almost everybody now that has some mass behavioral change to bring about simply applies Grunig's model. We're not going to go into the total model now, but he did discover that in the communication, the awareness phase, which starts this kind of change, there are 3 steps that the communication has to deliver, otherwise it won't be effective. The first thing is that the communication has to identify the problem. I'll call it a problem here. The problem, the opportunity, the subject, the issue. You have to identify it solidly so people agree with you it is a problem. So both of you can say, yeah, by golly, dereg is a problem. It's a social problem. After we do that, then we have to personalize the problem. We have to get people to say, hey, this problem affects me. In Grunig's study on drunk driving, remember, first he found that the campaign had to get everybody to say, yeah, drunk driving is really a problem. In phase 2, he said, you have to get a teetotaling couple in their mid-60s to understand that walking home from church at 12:30 on a bright, sunny Sunday afternoon